Do you ever get the feeling television isn't what it used to be?
So no. Brexit means Brexit.
We had to take a compulsory course called Combat Propaganda.
Boris Johnson once declared that his life's ambition was to be king of the world.
Does Yevgeny Lebedev have any connection with the Russian spy machine? Well, yes.
Find deeply offensive. Where is the evidence?
I don't care if they find it offensive.
The fundamental problem with Facebook is that it is accountable to no one.
The government was advised to invest money in the NHS. The government aren't listening to the evidence.
The kind of world I want to bring my child into.
And it's Friday night with Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes.
And I'm Hardeep Matharu. And we'll be bringing you what the papers don't say.
And what the TV doesn't tell you. So to keep us going, we're not GB News, we don't have any hedge funds behind us, we don't have any advertising. Do help us by going to our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/BylineTV/Byline TV, and there, if you sign up now, you can join our exclusive After Dark question and answer session after this live show. Hardeep, it's been quite a week, hasn't it?
Oh yes, I mean, I think it's been a momentous week. What with obviously the interview with Oprah Winfrey by Meghan and Harry. I mean, it's really lifted the lid on many structural problems we see in Britain today, from sort of class entitlement, racism, the stigma around mental health, misogyny, all sorts of issues. And I think it was really an iconic moment. It wasn't just about the monarchy, it was about power. I mean, iconic. Do you agree with that?
Iconic.
Yeah, I think it was a real moment which gave, it was really about some significant insights about the state of this country. I mean, I don't know, you look a bit uncomfortable, Peter.
What? I look uncomfortable?
A little bit, yeah. I don't know, it just feels like this is all a bit emotionally charged, your response. Just
Why?
me talking about Meghan and Harry and the issues they raised.
No, they're just a bit privileged, that's all. What are you saying?
I mean, are they? I mean, yeah, but privilege doesn't stop you suffering discrimination or from mental ill health. These issues should be taken importantly, regardless of who's saying them.
Okay, why are you getting at me?
Peter, look, I just think this is a disproportionately emotional response. And please, let's not get into this white, male, middle-class fragility. Not from you this week.
Fragility? Right. So,
where are you going?
I've had enough, I don't have to take this.
Peter.
I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, he's great, but we all know how disruptive he can be. Let's just hope he doesn't hand in his resignation to Byline Times in the next few hours. And it's all right, because we've got Sian Norris coming up, we've got Emma Jones on the show as well. Us women, we can all talk about how safe are women in Britain today. So we don't really need Peter anyway. I don't think we need him, so... Peter, you're back.
You fell for it. You fell for it. No. That was fun.
Oh, Peter, how did it feel to be channeling Piers Morgan?
To be honest, really, really easy. I mean, it is so amazing how quickly under your skin, there's this male fragility. Of course, I'm not fragile at all.
Yeah.
Completely unfragile. No, but it's just there all the time, lurking. I mean, it's just a very strange thing. It's so easy to do.
And this, of course, was Piers Morgan, the host of Good Morning Britain, who walked out of his own show and then resigned following comments that he made, saying that he didn't believe that Meghan Markle was being truthful in the interview she gave on Oprah Winfrey. Ofcom, the regulator, received more than 40,000 complaints over his conduct.
Yeah, no, it was a momentous week, but and I'm completely just saying, no, I do think it's iconic. People say that, these are rich, privileged people, it's just the royalty, but Auntie Barnett wrote a brilliant interview in the New Yorker yesterday. They are the state. You know, should we have a look at our digital front page? I think we pick it up on a lead headline story of yours.
Yeah.
What's it? The fairy tales over for Britain.
Yeah.
And I think this idea that, you know, especially Americans, we have this fairy tale image of royalty. And yet that is maintained or maligned by the tabloid press. And the other thing that's always felt, by the way, is why, you know, other people's private lives are their matter. Who they shag, what they do is generally, I would say, I'm allowed to use that word here. Yeah, shag is completely after the watershed.
Let's stop saying shag.
Oh, sorry. You just said it. Anyway, who they consort with should be up to them. But when it comes to royalty, it is a matter of state, isn't it? Who's, you know, because we don't have elections. We have primogeniture, you know, basically who is the way the succession happens.
Yes.
And I think it's just so
But that
difficult.
also exposes the vulnerability and the hollowness at the heart of monarchy. I mean, we're not in the times of empire and symbols now, are we? I mean, what relevance does it have to people today? And it has to be seen to have a perception which keeps it relevant. And of course...
And that's controlled by this. You'll talk with Emma Jones later on about the control of the media. Also, you know, the Queen is the head of state. So soldiers swear allegiance to the Queen and to the Crown has enormous powers. You know, we don't have a president, and we probably wouldn't want except when the Queen goes, which unfortunately she will have to one day, she's not immortal. Will we still believe in the monarchy and say, well, she links us to our imperial past? Born the same year as my mother didn't outlive her, didn't maybe have the same medical care she has, and maybe smoked a bit too much, to be honest. But my mother was born in 1926 when a quarter of the world was pink. And so, you know, went through World War II as a teenager, as Elizabeth did. So I do think it's important. It can't be ignored as just frippery and masquerades.
No, and also the interview raised, like I said, raised so many issues that, you know, those of us affected by those issues in Britain today, we can't just say, oh, this interview is just a big distraction, we need to get on to more important matters. You know, this revelation that, you know, a member of the royal family or the institution was concerned about the skin colour of Harry and Meghan's unborn child. I mean, that was... Yeah, it was devastating. It wasn't surprising, but it was definitely
you must
shocking.
have felt that, particularly as Punjabi backgrounds being patrolled by, you know, on
yeah,
issues
absolutely.
of colour.
And don't get me wrong. I mean, issues of colour or colourism, as they would be called, as they are called, they're, you know, prevalent in the community I come from. You know, my whole life, people have thought I was a white woman, and I'm completely Indian Punjabi. But hearing that, it was kind of just really boiled it down to, God, this is where we still are. And as you say, the monarchy is the symbolic figurehead of the country. They're meant to represent us. And this notion that it's still about colour, and definitely I don't think I'm the only person of colour who felt hearing that made us all feel, well, you know, no matter what you do, we'll never really be taken as British.
No, and that was a particularly mortal blow, I think, whether it's true. I'm sure it is true, by the way, but just who said it at what level. To the monarchy.
It wasn't the Queen or the Duke of Edinburgh.
We must make that, and it was said to Harry, and he won't tell who. But one thing we do know for sure is the press is racist. I mean, if you see, and you'll discuss with Emma Jones in a moment, but, you know, that is beyond doubt. And the amazing defence that Society's editors the guy who runs Society of Editors, to explain, Ian Murray. I've been to some of their events. I won't go again. I went in 2014. I think actually was Syed Javid praised my book on the phone hacking trial. But then the next year, you know, it's full of all the old suspects like Dacre, and he had to resign because people were pulling out the award system, wasn't it?
Well, so Ian Murray, basically, as soon as the interview had aired, he released a statement on behalf of the Society of Editors, an industry body, which said, no, the press is not bigoted in this country. Meghan had said a lot of the coverage around me was racist. And he said, that's not true. We're not going to stop holding powerful people to account. A lot of the members of that organisation did not agree. And yeah, of course, people started coming away from the award ceremonies and saying, you know, publicly they didn't agree with that.
Hopefully you'll talk to Emma about these award ceremonies
will.
and how the racket works. She knows it better than I do.
How the racket works.
She was part of the tabloid press.
But Meghan Markle and some of the issues around her treatment, Piers Morgan, misogyny, that wasn't the only discussion around women's rights this week.
Of course not. So Monday began with International Women's Day, but was soon overtaken by news of a devastating murder in Bristol. In a moment, we'll be talking to Sian Norris, our Europe and Social Affairs reporter on Byline Times. But first, let's go to Parliament. This Monday, when International Women's Day, Jess Phillips began to read out some of the names of the people, women killed by men in domestic violence in the year up to March 2021.
I appreciate that the Honourable Member for Birmingham Yardley is going to read a list of names. Honourable members will know that the reading of lists is prohibited in this chamber, but Mr. Speaker has given special dispensation, as has happened in previous years, to the Honourable Lady to read this particular, very sensitive and very important list. Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to all in the Speaker's offices for their consideration. It shows that Parliament, I think, is very committed to this issue. In this place, we count what we care about. We count the vaccines done, we count the number of people on benefits. We rule or oppose based on a count, and we obsessively track that data. We love to count data about our own popularity. However, we don't currently count dead women. No government study is done into the patterns every year of the data of victims of domestic abuse who are killed, die by suicide or die suddenly. Dead women is a thing we've all just accepted as part of our daily lives. Dead women is just one of those things. Killed women are not vanishingly rare. Killed women are common. Dead women do count, and thanks to the brilliant work of Karen Ingala-Smith and the Counting Dead Women project, and the academics and charities working on the femicide census, these women's lives and the scale of male violence against women can be known. Since last year on this day, these are the women killed in the UK, where a man has been convicted or charged as the primary perpetrator in the case. Vanita Knoll, Tracy Kidd, Nellie Mustafa, Zahida B, Josephine Kay, Shadika Mohsin Patel, Maureen Kidd, Wendy Morse, Nagiba Alariki, Elsie Smith, Kelly Stewart, Gwendolyn Bound, Ruth Williams, Victoria Woodall, Kelly Fitzgibbons, killed alongside her 2 daughters, Caroline Walker, Katie Walker, Zubaydah Salangi, Betty Dobbin, Sonia Calvi, Marianne Ishmael, Daniela Espirito Santo, Ruth Brown, Denise Keane Barnett Simmons, Jadwiga Sigjelski, Emma Jane McPartland, Louise Atkinson, Silk Hirshon Jones, Hyacinth Morris, Louise Smith, Claire Perry, Aya Hashim, Melissa Belshaw, Yvonne Lawson-McCann, Lindsay Alcock.
A small portion of the names Jess Phillips read out in Parliament. And in a moment, we'll come across another list by Karen Everard Smith of 31 women who've been murdered by men in the last 2 months alone. I made a mistake, by the way. Sarah Everard was not murdered in Bristol. I was confusing it with a very similar case of Joanna Yates, and I was actually in Bristol at the time. We might talk about that. But first, let me introduce you to somebody who's been writing for Byline Times for a year, and I've only met here for the first time. Sian, thank you for coming all the way from Bristol.
Thank you for having me. It's really good to meet everyone,
yes,
finally.
Finally, and we get you here. It's obviously lockdown. It's not because we didn't like her and didn't want to see her. Lockdown has prevented us. So the big issue of this week is the question we positive, is Britain safe for women?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a very strange week for women, and I think we've kind of gone through this this week of International Women's Day, which is supposed to be a real celebration, it's supposed to be a really positive moment, but I think actually some women are feeling quite down on International Women's Day in the last few years, feeling that it's become very corporate, it's become an opportunity for pink washing rather than an opportunity for change.
Can I just say, pink washing, just to explain that, because you did write a piece about this corporate and then not giving pay rises, but explain pink washing to people.
Pink washing is this kind of thing with greenwashing or eco-washing, isn't it? It's companies sort of putting out messages of female empowerment, putting out messages of female solidarity, but actually what is going on in those companies? What is their record on gender pay? What is their record on sexual harassment? You know, what do they actually do to improve quality of life for their female employees and for women around the world? The following day we had, the response to Meghan Markle interview, which obviously you've covered, but there was an awful lot of kind of misogyny and sexism around the way that she's been spoken about. And then the awful tragic news that they'd found human remains that have now been confirmed as the body of this young woman who was murdered in London, and the arrest of a police officer on suspicion of that murder. This is a case where it's the 31st woman who has been killed this year, where a man is the primary suspect in relation to that death. Obviously, court cases take a long time. We can't say in all of those cases whether it was manslaughter, whether it was murder, whether the person has been arrested is even the guilty party. But it is very, very painful, to constantly be reminded of the vulnerability of women and of the position of women in this society where male violence is so normalised and has become so accepted that actually 31 women can have died and we don't even know most of their names. And that's why it's so important, Karen Ingala-Smith's project, which has been running since 2010, I think, where she's recorded every single year the names of women that have been murdered or killed by men. And every year Jess Phillips has been reading them out as part of this International Women's Day debate. It's important we remember their names, and it's important that we recognise that these were people. They're not statistics. It's not 2 women a week murdered by a partner. It's not 3 women a week murdered by men. These are women, and they have names, and they had histories.
So why did this week, was it because it's the same week as International Women's Day, Meghan Markle, or was there something about, because it was most people, women, are killed by men, I assume that they know, not by a stranger?
Yeah.
So was that the stranger thing, which happens often, doesn't it, with like murders? You're most likely to be killed by somebody you know, and it's the stranger murders. Do you think that, or was it something else which tipped the point? Because in a way, though I know you were having a march planned and it can't happen, we'll talk about that later, it has a slight echo of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter. It's like it gets to a breaking point and people have just had enough.
I think it's a combination of all of those factors. I think, first of all, the killing of women is, as we can see, not rare. It's all too common. It's frighteningly common. It's commonplace. We don't see. It's not normally newsworthy. It might be in the local paper. This is a more unusual situation where it was what we understand to be a stranger abduction. And I think for a lot of women, particularly women who may not have been in abusive situations themselves, or who have thankfully not had to go through that, there's that sense that it could have been us. We could have been walking home that night. 9:30 isn't late. I would never think twice of walking home at 9:30. I know some women do, but for me that's a normal time to be walking around. So there was that sense that, she could be us. We could have been in that situation. And I think that really galvanised a lot of women, and that sense of, commonality and common experience. The other factor is that every single woman that I know, and I'm sure this is true again for most women, has had an experience of harassment, had an experience of sexual assault on the streets, walking around. There was a survey that came out this week that said 97% of 18 to 24-year-olds has experienced sexual harassment. That is 97% of young women who are growing up in a world where that is normal, that is their normality. And again, for most of us, that statistic isn't surprising. I was first harassed on the street when I was 14. I was in my school uniform. That's a lifetime that women go through. And the other thing is, as you say, this tipping point. I think women are done. And that was what I sent to my best friend at one point on this week. I was like, women are done. We have had enough. We are sick of having men tell us, oh, not all men. We are sick of having the police say, women, stay at home, don't go outside, this is dangerous. That was the message men were saying in 1977. And we're now in 2021, and women are still being told to modify their behaviour to stay safe from male violence. And men are not being told anything.
So is that the solution to educate men better? I mean, there were some great lines I read, not by men, by the way. It was like, I forget who it was, forgive me whoever tweeted this, but it's a great line. We know it's not all men, but we don't know which ones it is.
Yes,
Or
Emma
was that
Burnell's
fact?
tweet was such a good, powerful message.
Yeah, and there's a, I can say as a man, but it's, and those statements, as a father of a daughter, as a husband of a wife, as a son of a mother, with, you know, that women are only due to be protected by male surveillance, white knights coming on. I mean, is that what's needed to be done, or just a general overhaul, education of men and their sort of paternalistic attitudes? What is the core solution?
I think one of the main solutions is to talk, for men to talk amongst themselves. You know, there's this kind of line on the left, it's not up for me to educate you. I think that's problematic. We should be having open conversations. We should be starting discussions. But men need to challenge other men, and that doesn't happen enough. If you have a male friend as a man who has made a sexist joke, you know, who has gone sort of oi oi walking down the street, those kind of things that you might just think is, oh, he's just a bit of a laugh, they're just having fun. But actually the reality when you're a woman and some guy is like shouting at you as you're walking past, you don't know where that shout is going to go. You don't know if you can just keep walking and it will just dissipate, or if they're going to get angry. So you have to be, like, men need to challenge each other a lot more. The other solution, of course, is to have, and then you'll know from my articles that I bang on about this all the time, comprehensive relationships and sex education, to get young people talking about consent, to get young people talking about respect. You know, these are really vital conversations if we're going to change the culture about how women are seen in society. And the final thing that I would say as well is that men need to start listening to women. You know, if women are going up on social media, and of course right now it is on social media because we're all stuck at home all the time, saying, this happened to me, I'm upset, this has been really distressing, don't reply by going, if you left your keys in the ignition of a car, you would expect to get it stolen. You know, women are not cars. We're not open doors in houses. Walking down the street doesn't mean we've made ourselves vulnerable. You know, we should be allowed to have exactly the same freedoms as men have. We should have the exact same human rights, the exact access to public space. And yet more and more women are being pushed and pushed into these little corners. We're having to repress our own freedoms. We're having to make our lives smaller because some men choose to hurt us, and that is not acceptable.
Do you think also there's, you wrote about the rape statistics, the number of rape allegations that go to trial. There are allegations and it's a suspect only. There was another incident with the suspect. That there are precursor behaviours, which because we're talking about a very extreme thing, murder, abduction of a stranger. But, you know, and I'm just saying as a man, when I've heard about men I've known who turned out to be abusive, I had no clue. I'm not saying it's my ignorance or whatever. They don't present to other men, I'm going to do this. They hide it from men as well. But I just wonder if there's sort of precursor behaviours, like beyond just the education thing, where, which could stop men getting to this situation, or stop even those early behaviours. More importantly, make women feel safer.
Absolutely. There's been some really interesting research, and there's a book that's just come out by Dr. Jane Monckton-Smith with Bloomsbury, which is looking at the kind of the 8 steps to homicide, I think she calls it. And there's another book in the States by Rachel Louise Snyder, which again looks at the kind of patterns that happen. And what they're finding is that there will be these kind of actions, such as, you know, flashing, such as, I should say indecent exposure, sorry, flashing is such a minimising word, you know, such as kind of harassment and assault, or even, you know, tolerance of sexist behaviours. And I think one of the things that's most important about that is when we look at domestic violence murders in particular, so when a woman has been killed by her partner. There was a case last month where a man was given 5 years for manslaughter, having killed his partner in lockdown. And it was portrayed as this kind of explosion, you know, he lost control. Of course, I do not know the details of that case. That may well, you know, be the complete truth of it. But a lot of the time we have this idea it was an explosion, he lost control. He found out she was having an affair and he lost control. He found she was nagging and he lost control. It's very, very rare that someone just loses control. Like, there is generally a pattern of behaviours, be that in domestic abuse, a long pattern of violence or a long pattern of coercive control. Or, you know, we've seen this case with the murder in Hull, where the person who was convicted, again last month, had a history of voyeurism and a history of indecent exposure. So we could see these kind of patterns of aggressive male behaviour. But most importantly, of women not being listened to when they reported those aggressive male behaviours, which allow these men to continue to commit these crimes. And of course, one of the most awful cases of that was the John Warboys case, who was the black cab rapist. And there's some suggestions that he raped up to 100 women. I mean, he wasn't convicted for that many. And there's a terrible interview on Channel 4 News with the first woman that went to the police. And I will never forget it. She said, "If only I'd been more believable." And as if it was her responsibility to stop this from happening. But actually, it was the police's responsibility to believe her.
Yeah, a whole overhaul of that system, which happened with child sexual abuse.
Yes.
To a certain extent, the victims, alleged victims or complainants were believed. You've also written this week about, and I've seen it with friends of mine, like Carl Cadwallader, we've seen the first political assassination of a British politician was a woman only 4 years ago, nearly 5, first since 1979, and Erin Eve, I believe. That there's a mounting sense of violence, language and stalking behaviour online, and particularly towards journalists, is that right? I mean,
yeah, I think if we go back to this question, is Britain safe for women? Well, let's have a look at, is Britain safe for women journalists and women in public life, as in women politicians? Clearly not. There was a piece of research that came out from Reporters Without Borders for International Women's Day that said 73% of journalists that they surveyed had experienced violence online, and that it's now the most violent place to be a women journalist. You know, this is a shocking amount of abuse that is being thrown at women in public life. And very, very similar patterns as well. And Caroline Criado Perez has written about this, I think. There's often a focus in online abuse against women on your throat and on your mouth. And it's this idea, you know, we need to shut you up. Yeah. You need to stop speaking. And what's really concerning about this is, A, it's horrible for women who are going through it, but also what message are we sending to the next generation of women? We've been working so hard to improve the representation of women in public life, to make sure that we have women in positions of power, to get women into Parliament. Would you want to be a politician if you thought you were if men were writing to you saying they were going to do a Joe Cox on you? You wouldn't want to take up that space.
and so they get what they want, they silence.
Yeah.
And I've certainly seen this online. Obviously, oddly enough, in a Maltese court this week, was the man behind who's confessed to killing Daphne Caruana Galizia, known as the Maltese WikiLeaks, which was a great journalist who was killed in a car bomb now 3 years ago. And so there's a precursor behaviours you can see, surely. If you're being intimidated online to stop talking, and then some people, there are the politicians we know of, we might be able to report later, women politicians being threatened. These are credible threats. They stop being just online trolling, don't they?
Absolutely, and it almost goes back to Emma Burnell's tweet, it's not all men, but we don't know which ones. How do you know which threat is real? How do you know which one you should take seriously? You know, and I think that's another issue that women experience of people going, don't feed the trolls, it's just online. But it's not always just online. And it's happening within an atmosphere where 97% of young women have experienced harassment, where women have a 1 in 70 chance of seeing their rapist convicted. You know, these threats are happening in an atmosphere where violence against women is already normal and already frighteningly common. So why would you think, oh no, that's not going to happen to me, that's not real, just because it's online? But on the plus side, I think, you know, we do see a real upsurge of women speaking up and speaking out. And I think one of the really wonderful things to take away of what has been a horrible week is a sense of sisterhood and solidarity, of women coming together, sharing their stories and being in support of one another. You know, we put out an open letter in the Eye that was organised by Frances Leach. 200 women signed that, saying that we need better for women and we need to do better on violence against women. Unfortunately, the High Court has ruled against the vigils taking place, but thousands of women stood up and said, we want to be in solidarity with each other this weekend. We won't be able to because it's against the law, but that was an important action and an important moment of solidarity, which we should all be quite proud of, I think.
Very much so. And there's a great line I wrote, my first book about cities, was a quiet street's a dangerous street. Much like that, if it's a busy street, more people there, and certainly from this, more women come onto the streets and protest their presence. That's the answer to the people trying to shut you up and silence you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Strengthen numbers, strengthen solidarity, and refusing to be silenced.
Well, look, you must come back to the Byline Times TV, Byline TV studio on Friday night, Byline Times very soon. We'll talk about other issues, and do read some of Sian's fantastic work. There's 4 stories on the front page of bylinetimes.com this Friday. But obviously, misogyny is the most extreme end in murder, rape, and these threats against women, but it also rears its head in other ways. In a moment, Hardeep will be talking to Emma Jones about the tabloid response to Meghan Markle and what has happened this week reveals about the misogyny and racism in our press. But before we go to that, those who think that Meghan Markle is just this sort of celebrity star who happened to marry into royalty, for those who haven't seen it, here's a fantastic clip of her as a 12-year-old, I believe, protesting against sexist advertising and doing something about it.
It's the first time little Meghan Markle was on TV, and she was a firecracker even at age 11.
I don't think it's right for kids to grow up thinking these things, that just mom does everything.
For a social studies assignment way back in elementary school in Los Angeles, Meghan and her classmates were asked to watch some commercials and assess their messages.
Recommended by more doctors, pharmacists, and Dr. Mom.
It's always mom does this and mom does that.
In particular, a commercial for Ivory dishwashing liquid caught her attention because it used the word women.
Women are fighting greasy pots and pans.
And I said, wait a minute, how could somebody say that?
Even back then, Meghan struck everyone with her easy charm and intelligence.
Just about 1 out of every 3 commercials is gonna say something that's gonna hurt somebody's feelings.
So Meghan took pen in hand and wrote a letter to Procter & Gamble. And just look at that penmanship.
So I was wondering if you would be able to change your commercial to people all over America.
Here's the shocker. The company actually changed the commercial to say people, not women.
The gloves are coming off. People are fighting greasy pots and pans with Ivory Clear.
What Meghan did landed her on the cable show Nick News in 1993, hosted by Linda Ellerby.
It was absolutely clear that this young woman was strong in her beliefs. It didn't matter if she was 11 years old. She believed in women, she believed in her own power, and she wasn't afraid to reach out and say, I want my power, I want my rights.
Good evening.
Many years later, Meghan spoke about the Ivory dishwashing liquid commercial.
At the age of 11, I had created my small level of impact by standing up for equality.
Back in 1993, Meghan had these words of advice for fellow kids across America.
If you see something that you don't like or offended by on television or any other place, write letters and send them to the right people, and you can really make a difference for not just yourself, but lots of other people.
And now I'm with Emma Jones, who's a board member of the campaigning Hacked Off and a former tabloid journalist. Emma, thanks for coming in.
It's my pleasure.
Is the British tabloid press racist?
Well, I mean, it was the response, wasn't it, this week that was so indicative of the problem with the tabloid press. Instead of like any other industry or organisation saying we take these allegations seriously, we're going to examine ourselves. We are, perpetrators of apparently truths. We are people who give information to the nation. We have a responsibility. Instead, the Society of Editors just out and out said, no, we're not racist, no problem here, move along. That's the whole problem with the tabloid press. And to say that, I don't want to sit there and say, yes, the whole tabloid press is racist. Lots of people are saying that. And I think there are good and there are bad elements to the tabloid press. And I don't think we should abolish the tabloid press or anything like that. But you don't have to look very hard to see evidence of racism in the tabloid press. Not very hard at all. I mean, look at the columnist for the Sun newspaper who called migrants cockroaches. It's the language they use, it's the tone, it's all these different things that add up to a picture that promotes and encourages and incites hate, actually.
And I think it's actually a real barrier to, people from minority communities saying, oh, journalism is something I could get into. If what you're actually seeing as the product is, you know, discriminating against and creating scapegoats of people like yourself. It's not really encouraging, is it?
Yeah, I think there's two problems and there's two issues. And the tabloid press have been keen this week to say, oh, we're going to change our newsrooms and we are going to be more diverse. I've heard that for 20 years, by the way. A bit of tokenism they might be partial to, but so far it hasn't added up to anything else. But it's a different issue, isn't it? Is the content in our national newspapers racist? Does it promote racial violence? And I think that's the question that they've carefully sidestepped. I would like to see more diversity in newsrooms, of course, and that would definitely help. Not just racial, but also, you know, see more people from different backgrounds. At the moment, you get a very, very small slice of society working in national newspapers.
And often, you know, diversity isn't found at the top sort of editorial level, and that is obviously what sets the tone for publications, let alone the proprietors of these papers.
God, I mean, if you could meet the people at the top, I mean, they're the same people who've been there for as long as I worked in newspapers, which, you know, when I started was 20 something years ago. I'm not going to say how long, but it's exactly the same people at the top. They've been promoted and they promote the same values. And the other problem is the bullying in newsrooms and the misogyny in newsrooms. And they don't know any different. It always surprised me when I worked at the Sun newspaper. Don't hate me, but I worked at the Sun newspaper, and you basically never got out the office. These are people who arrive at work when it's dark and go home when it's dark. They have no idea what's going on in the real world. They don't know about the way society works and how people's attitudes have changed. And I think this week's really showing them up to be the sort of old-fashioned kind of dead in the water embarrassment that they are. It's a really bad reflection on the whole industry, and I think the whole industry now, people have gone, hang on a minute, you know, this is an embarrassment. It's got to change.
And can you relate on your experiences working for the Sun or other newspapers? I mean, how did you feel doing the sort of work that, you know, contributes to the output of the Sun or some of the other tabloids?
I mean, I started on the Sunday Mirror and I was a news reporter, and it was really exciting and brilliant. And then sort of celebrity culture crept in as people like Piers Morgan moved through the ranks and became editors. And suddenly there was more of a focus on that kind of journalism. It was cheap. It meant that, you know, investigations and proper news reporting cost money. And also people like Piers could do that sort of work by going out with his friends, and you know, deals were made, and you can stick a story on the papers. It's a win-win for the celebrity and for him, or for the PR and him, or whoever it is. Substitute his name for Rebecca Brooks, whoever you want. But what I found as a woman was suddenly they didn't want me to do news reporting anymore. They wanted me to do celebrity reporting because I was young, I was female. They thought that it would be attractive to me to go to parties and chat up D-list celebrities or whoever, you know, A-list celebrities. And to be quite frank, none of that was attractive to me. And I think that's the problem. A lot of journalists don't go into, most journalists I would say, don't go into journalism to do that sort of stuff. But they find that within a culture of a newsroom, it becomes very difficult for them to have a voice, because the attitude in a newsroom is if you don't do it, you're out the door, someone else will do it. They're very difficult places to work. And they're not places where you can talk about mental health. They're not places where you can talk about women's issues. They're not places where you can raise issues about childcare or anything like that. So that's one side of that coin. There were also an awful lot of men in charge. Bullying bosses, the sort of language you had to listen to and put up with. I mean, one of my bosses was Dominic Mohan, and I remember him regularly referring to female celebrities as a pig in a dress, and that famous story that he did with Jade Goody, who obviously sadly died.
She was on Big Brother.
Yeah, Get the Pig Out was the headline. That is indicative of the attitude in the newsrooms, and that hasn't changed. But this has been brilliant this week, but because for once these people have been called out, and a few journalists have been brave enough to stand up to them which never happens because it's career suicide if you do that.
And just looking at another structural aspect of it, so one of the things Harry said in this Oprah interview was he described it as an invisible contract that exists between the royal family and predominantly the right-wing tabloid press, you know, to keep themselves relevant, to keep them on side with the public. The royal family relies on these newspapers, presenting them in a certain way to the public. And essentially, he was saying that they're running scared of what the tabloids are doing and therefore weren't willing to correct these stories about Meghan that were in the press. Now, I mean, is the public at large aware of that, would you say?
Well, I think that was the most fascinating part of what Harry said, you know, that I don't think anybody talks about that. It's not just the relationship that the royal family have, but the one that he so eloquently explained, you know, the fact that basically they have this silent contract, almost like with the mafia, whereby they play their part in the hope that nothing bad's written about them. But the same thing happens with the government as well. And that's why Leveson too got cancelled, obviously, because the government for years and years and years and the press have had this sort of symbiotic relationship, which has meant that, you know, the government of the time is able to stay safe, keep good news in the papers and not be effectively challenged. So this is the situation we're in. Effectively, these sort of dark relationships, the ones between the royal family and the government, the structures of this country and the press are the things that are holding the establishment in place. It really has shone a spotlight on Britain for the first time. It's brilliant.
It has, yeah.
But, you know, for Harry to talk out about that doesn't normally happen. But remember, you know, he's talked before about when his mother died. He said that there were photographers taking pictures in that car while she was still alive, and instead of helping her, they continued to take pictures. So you can see that it is coming from the heart. And whilst I'm sure he's been told over the years to put up and shut up like the rest of them, that's obviously burnt a hole in his soul. And he said, right, you know, I'm going to speak out about that. So it'll be interesting to see what the other royals do, because by the sounds of what he was saying, nobody is very happy there anyway.
No, he described they're all trapped in the system, which I thought was like an extraordinary way for Prince Harry to describe members of his own family who seemed to sit at the core of apparently what Britain is, which I thought was really interesting.
But remember the reason that the papers put the royals on the front pages isn't for public. The only reason that they do it is to make money, essentially. You know, it's not public interest journalism. They'll use the public interest journalism line, but it's just to make money and get more advertising. That's the whole point of it.
So they build them up, they bring them down.
Yeah, and also, you know, royal stories are good to just sort of splash out there to distract from other things that might be happening at the time.
Can we just going back really briefly about, you were saying that there was this very significant change from sort of, you know, reporting public interest journalism to news, predominantly in the tabloids, which is completely dominated by celebrity. What sort of are the main corrosive effects of that we have seen over a number of years now? I mean, how do we start to tackle that? You know, the more you give people a certain thing, the more they seem to want it, and you just go round and round.
That's what the papers will say, isn't it? They'll say, oh, well, this is what people want to read, and that's why we do it. But in actual fact, when tabloid newspapers were doing really good investigative stories, their figures were much better. You know, their sales are in free fall, and perhaps if they tried to do better journalism and put more investment into doing stories that were genuinely in the public interest, they might see their sales go up again. Obviously, you know, it's a diverse world now and people get their information all over the place, but make no mistake, the newspapers are the ones that they're putting that information across the internet. They're the ones whose stories are being fed and clicked upon, and their clickbait is the thing that drives all that. So
it's like not a whole industry, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, you know, they have a massive reach.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, your original question was, what do we do about that? Or
yeah, I mean, this shift, complete shift, we see in the very dominating mainstream media, which is celebrity culture and sort of, you know, bread and circuses, essentially.
Well, you know, if you were to go along with the argument that the press have, that this is what people want to see, you know, we'll just end up putting kittens on front pages and videos of kittens on their websites. And that's obviously not what people want to see. There's a substantial majority of people in this country who do want to read proper news. They do want to understand the world around them. And I don't think they do want to sort of just see this celebrity culture churned out. But you know, nobody ever talks about that, and you certainly won't see it talked about in the papers, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, again, Harry's comments about the media. Well, I mean, they received no widespread coverage at all. I mean,
the first thing.
But why would they?
This is a crisis for the monarchy. It was interesting on Question Time last night, though. You know, there was a member of the audience who was on the screen, and she said no. The main thing that came out of that was that our tabloid press are bigoted and they are racist. People know this, and for the first time, you know, this week, that information's out there and people are talking about these things, and the press are running scared and don't know what to do about it other than bully back, which we've seen in the Mail, I think, today. All those people who, you know, bravely and tentatively stood up and said they didn't want to be involved in the Royal Society of Editors Award ceremony. They were all called out. The same thing happened to me when I was working for Impress, which was the body set up after Leveson to independently regulate newspapers. I was called a press zealot, a press hater, and my picture was put in the Sun newspaper where, you know, I used to work a long time ago. Luckily it was a 20-year-old picture, so it kept me young, but but the fact is, if you do stand up and say anything as a journalist, your options become limited.
Very limited, exactly. I mean, Brian Cathcart, who I believe is one of the founders of Hacked Off, he wrote a piece for Byline Times this week, echoing exactly what you're saying, that maybe this could be more than a moment if, you know, the journalists with standards this time actually stand up and be counted and say, actually, we just don't want to go along with these things, which clearly are unethical, clearly have racial undertones, clearly going after marginalised groups, etc. How realistic do you think that is? I mean, how can we turn this not into a moment but a movement?
Well, yeah, I think it's something I've been thinking about a lot this week. It's difficult, it's delicate. A lot of journalists are naturally defiant people who don't want to be told that there's another way. But there is also the ability now to speak as a journalist on your Twitter page or anything else, and have a voice outside of newspapers. I think the other thing, the reason I am so keen on regulation, or one of the reasons that I'm keen on regulation and a better, more healthy journalistic system in this country, is because I think that, as I was describing a little bit earlier, I don't think journalists are treated well in newsrooms, and I do think we could make their lives better and their jobs easier. As we see all these journalist jobs going, you know, you see people being treated worse and worse. They should be protected, and I think that they should demand protection. And I think if people start to stand together, much as you were talking about with women, in solidarity, strength in numbers, that it's going to be something that the newspapers can't ignore. My fear is, as I said, it's the same people at the top, and you might get just tokenism again. You know, we'll employ a few people from ethnic minorities. We'll give them a column. It will look good. How to implement substantial change? I think you've got to get rid of those people. A lot of them, you know, are facing criminal action anyway in the future, and are still paying out millions in the High Court 10 years after Leveson to shut up the people who are still taking them to task for getting into their medical records, hacking phones. All manner of illegal activities that have been going on. It's, at the moment, you know, there's criminality and never mind racism, at the heart of newspapers, and that's not being talked about or investigated. The whole swamp has to be drained almost, you know, and it needs a clean slate and start again.
Yeah, I mean, this is something Peter and I often talk about with Byline Times. It's instead of, you know, trying to be let in by the mainstream systems, whatever those systems are, there's numerous of them, why don't we try and change the landscape? You know, create new platforms where, you know, you can start to introduce different voices and, you know, truthful, factual investigation again. If you had your time again, would you still, well, if you were 18 now, would you go into journalism?
God, yeah. I mean, I loved it. It was like I was so happy when I got my first shift on the Mirror, and I, you know, it was a really exciting time, and I loved it. Yeah, definitely. Journalism's a really important job, and my heart's in the same place. It's just I'd like to see more platforms for people and more support for journalists and people investing in decent journalism, because a lot of it boils down to money. But definitely, I would encourage anyone to be, you know, if they're that kind of person, and it does take a certain kind of person, go for it.
I guess when one knows the value of good journalism and, you know, what it can do, it can change people's lives. I mean, when that's in your head, great journalism can do that. Then journalism is an amazing job.
And it can be fun as well. You know, great journalism is about having fun. I went to some amazing places, had some fun, met some amazing people as well. But had some very unhappy times as well, particularly at the Sun newspaper, which was a really, really unpleasant place to work. And if I was to change anything, I would never have gone back there. Never in a million years.
Emma, thank you so much for coming in and joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Now, with the news that the BBC has cancelled the MASH report, a satirical show often critical of the government, Peter Jukes dissected some of the questionable developments at our public service broadcaster.
So today's news is the BBC has cancelled the satirical show The MASH Report, presented by Nish Kumar. Now, this certainly has nothing to do with the fact that the current Director General is a big Tory supporter, and its new chair, Richard Sharp, has donated £600,000 to the Conservative Party. The fact that the MASH report would extensively take the piss out of Boris Johnson and other politicians had nothing at all whatsoever to do with the cancellation of the show. And if you believe that, you believe anything. Now, BBC executives have been on the record to say that BBC comedy is a bit too left-wing and anti-Brexit. So they should come up with new comedy formats. For example, Nigel Farage's Flying Circus, or perhaps LOLO Customs Inspector, or Have I Got Procurement for You? It's ridiculous. What this reveals is these right-wing libertarians and their emphasis on free speech and their protestations about cancel culture want to cancel other people's culture. They want to limit our free speech. And we should always remember that free speech is there to protest against power, to punch up and not punch down. So that was Emma Jones, who obviously some home truths there. I mean, what she's saying about the criminality is fascinating, because we don't know. There are ongoing civil cases. And of course we have, for people who don't know, the Daniel Morgan independent panel report coming out in about a month and a half, which is very much about the criminality involved in the press, going back 34 years to an axe murder.
I loved Emma's, it was such a simple point that she made, but she said, yeah, I mean, if the public aren't necessarily aware of this invisible contract between the monarchy and the press, what would they say about the government and the press?
It's the whole state. So the monarchy, the government, this triangle
it's just so...
of the dark. We know with the government, it's just a dark deal. They're giving them millions of pounds, up to 50, 60 million to keep them afloat.
At the moment, during the pandemic, they've been giving them money in advertising.
Subsidised, sponsored advertising. We caught one of the ads being pro-Brexit ad. They're not very well billed, and one had a rather funny backstory. Yeah, and of course, Johnson and Gove, both journalists.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or pundits, I wouldn't say they're journalists, they're columnists. And that's a cartel between these billionaire press owners, billionaire now TV and hedge fund owned TV like GB News, is sort of, and so there's a darkness at the centre of our state, isn't there? It's a contract which we don't get to see as the public.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that the Meghan and Harry interview illuminated all of these things in a way that perhaps people weren't expecting. And I think next week there'll be something else people will be talking about. But I do think that interview will have, it will still reverberate for years to come.
Well, I think there's them overplaying. Every 10 years that the press overplays its hand. It's coming up to the 10-year anniversary of Millie Dowler and phone hacking.
Yeah.
And I suspect that what we're going to have is, this is another moment, because ever since they couldn't hack phones, more importantly, bribe cops for more information, because that's what they used to do. That was a key part of the trials, was that payments to public officials for information like crimes and things like that. What do they have left? They couldn't hack your phones, they couldn't bribe cops. Let's monster minorities. And the royalty, who before Meghan never fought back. Now Meghan did, what's really annoyed the press, I think, is them beating the Mail, this Mail on Sunday, on that privacy, which actually is a copyright case in the end. That's infuriating, because the royals had this contract, they never sued. And so the tabloid press generate all this money knowing they never get sued by the royals. Meghan and Harry broke that contract. Have we got the front page ready to go, guys? Yeah, of the print edition. Yeah. The tabloids and royalty. So anyway, to remind everybody, we'll be back in 10 minutes if you get your credit cards out and join us on patreon.com. But we're going to have a Q&A afterwards. Sian will still be here. She's in the background. We'll get her on. Hardeep will be here and I'll be here to answer any of your questions. We need your support. This doesn't come for free, a studio like this. Not that expensive though. Nothing, probably like one lunch for GB News. But if you go to Patreon and just support us, that would be fantastic, and you get all these added benefits. So I think that's been a fascinating discussion.
It has. It's been a fantastic show, and you got to walk out, and I got to pretend
what do you mean? I didn't walk
run
out.
the show,
What are you
which
saying?
I can.
I'm really
but
offended.
Yes, we'll see you back in 10 minutes, and thank you to everyone else who's joined. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.